Crucible of the Vampire. Written by Amanda Murray. Narrated by Gemma Lawrence. Chapter 7. Footsteps in the Dark. Isabelle awoke the next morning to the sounds of the rooks outside her window and the shards of morning light casting coloured shadows on the white bedsheets. She was startled to find herself back in her own bed. The memories of last night came flooding back. Throwing back the sheets, she jumped out of bed and went straight across to the large mirror. Scooping up her blonde hair with one hand, she examined her neck to see if there were any marks. Nothing. Confused, she wondered whether last night had been a dream. Everything was so strange and unreal in this house that she couldn't be entirely sure of what was real and what was imagined. Carl, Evelyn and Scarlett were already at breakfast when she made her way into the dining room. She seated herself at the table and poured herself a coffee, trying to ignore the awkwardness between herself and Scarlett. In the cold light of day, she felt brittle with guilt. She hadn't had time to process all that had happened, or how she felt. Her flustered thoughts were a cacophony of confusion that raged in her brain. Her only way of dealing with this was to try and suppress all her emotions. After all, she was here to do a job, and there was just one niggling doubt in her mind. Had she dreamt last night? "Did you sleep well, dear?" Evelyn asked her daughter, who was dressed in a crimson tight-fitting jumper and was smiling slyly at Isabelle. "Like a lamb, Mummy," Scarlett purred like a cat. "And how did you sleep, Isabelle?" Isabelle felt uncomfortable and confused. She hesitated before answering. "I was dreaming a lot." "Pleasant ones?" mused Evelyn as she sipped her tea from a blue and yellow china cup. "A bit mixed, to be honest." "Oh, do tell us about them." "Well, it's all a bit of a jumble." Isabelle pushed her hair back from her face with a slightly shaky hand and concentrated hard on her piece of toast. She took a few gulps of her coffee, thinking that even at this hour she could do with something stronger. Carl had been staring out of the window distractedly, ignoring the conversation. The noise of a truck sounded outside as it pulled up on the gravel drive. Carl gave Evelyn a knowing look. The driver from the truck knocked loudly on the front door, the noise echoing throughout the house. Carl immediately jumped up. "I'll go," he said, dashing off in the direction of the front door, with quite the spring in his step. The breakfast party heard the sounds of the front door opening and the muffled exchanges between Carl and the delivery man. "Stirring some sugar into her drink," Evelyn persisted, smiling sweetly at Isabelle. "Tell us what you can remember. It's amazing how revealing even the fragments of a dream can be." At this point, Scarlett, who'd been listening intently and staring quite hard at Isabelle, piped up. "Yes, do tell us what you dreamt about." Isabelle looked down at her toast, feeling embarrassed. I'm not sure I can remember anything, to be honest. As I said, it's all a bit of a jumble." "Oh, that's a shame." "Well, never mind. Perhaps you'll have the same dream again." Scarlett smirked at Isabelle as she said this. She moved her hand underneath the table and stroked Isabelle lightly on her thigh. Isabelle almost jumped out of her skin, and she was immensely relieved when Carl came rushing back into the dining room. He was in a highly animated state, waving his arms about, his face flushed with excitement. "It's here! It's here! The other half of the cauldron is here!" he shouted breathlessly, and turning to Isabelle, he said, "Come on! You can get on and verify our half now." Evelyn tried to curb her husband's enthusiasm. "Carl, she hasn't even had her breakfast yet." "Oh, yes, quite. Well, obviously, when you're ready. Good. In the meantime, I'll move it down to the cellar," he muttered, and hurried out of the room, leaving the others to their toast and marmalade. Isabelle had never seen him move so fast. Isabelle gulped down her coffee. Not only was she keen to escape the prying eyes of Scarlett and her mother, but she was also excited to see if the other half of the cauldron was, indeed, a match. Though if indeed it did prove to be the missing piece, she dreaded the whole money conversation that she knew she'd have to have with Carl. She wished that the professor was here to handle that side of things. He was always so much better at dealing with these kinds of situations, but in his absence, she'd have to do her best. Her job depended on it. Gathering up her notebooks and tools, she made her way down to the cellar, where she saw Carl pacing around in an agitated state. The packing box with the other half of the stone cauldron that Professor Edwards had shipped to the hall was sitting near the excavation site. Carl reluctantly left Isabelle to unpack the newly arrived cauldron. She began to remove the layers of packaging slowly and painstakingly, as if it were a priceless object. When it emerged out of the box, Isabelle carefully placed it next to the freshly dug-up half. She spent several hours kneeling on the cellar floor, poring over the two halves of the cauldron, meticulously aligning them together. They fitted perfectly. Unable to stay away for too long, Carl had returned to the cellar to check on progress. Isabelle could tell that he was still agitated, without even having to see the expression on his face. He was breathing heavily and pacing up and down impatiently. Getting up from the cellar floor and dusting off some soil, Isabelle looked at the expectant Carl. "Well, I don't think there's much doubt about it. Congratulations, Mr. Scott-Morton. You found the missing half of the cauldron." Leaning down and pointing to a dark, jagged line on either side of the cauldron, Isabelle continued. "You can see the two halves are a very good match. The cut seems to have been made by a very sharp-bladed instrument. Even allowing for some distortion to the pieces down the centuries, you can tell they're halves of the same piece." Even in the dim light of the cellar, Isabelle could see the look of euphoria creep across Carl's face. It wasn't often she'd seen him smile, but he was barely able to contain his glee. His eyes glinted with anticipation. "Excellent! That really is excellent news." Now the two halves are reunited, you can see the whole inscription. The original stuff is some sort of Brythonic writing which is beyond me, but this later graffiti is interesting. You see here, Profanum Quibus Pythonicus. All very creepy. Carl shrugged his shoulders and looked nonplussed. "Really?" "Loosely translated, it means unholy necromancer." "Sounds like nonsense." Carl continued looking intently at the cauldron, avoiding any eye contact with Isabelle. Could she detect his euphoria diminishing? "Well, of course it is, but it ties in with John Stern, and also a document from the 1800s that I found in your library. I meant to mention it to you earlier. It's a journal entry by someone who stayed at the house. It seems they were frightened off by a ghost. You know, I said I had a dream at breakfast." Carl's demeanour had suddenly changed. His body visibly tensed, and he gripped his hands tightly. He looked darkly at Isabelle and said through gritted teeth, "There are no ghosts in this house. I would know. Look, shouldn't you be calling the professor to tell him the news?" Isabelle was taken aback by his sudden mood change, and involuntarily took a step backwards away from him. The chilly atmosphere became almost palpable. Slightly flustered and desperately trying to regain control of the situation, she said, Of course I will, but I need to finish a full examination of the cauldron so I can brief him properly. Then he can give you an idea of the value. It's getting late now, I'll do it in the morning." "Well, you'd better be up early then, hadn't you?" Carl sneered at Isabelle and turned on his heels and marched off, leaving her alone in the cellar with the cauldron. She knelt back down on the cold flagstone floor and looked intently at the strange inscriptions which were carved on the sides of the cauldron. "What are you trying to tell me?" Isabelle thought, as she traced the ancient chiselled symbols with her finger. Isabelle emerged from the cellar cold and still perplexed at Carl's reaction. She just couldn't get this feeling of foreboding out of her mind. She headed towards the kitchen, which was situated at the back of the hall, housed in the newer Victorian additions. It was where the servants would have worked, and this was reflected in the style of architecture and decoration. The wooden floors gave way to red quarry tiles, and the rooms and ceilings were lower and much less ornate. The large oak-panelled dining room was on her left, and Isabelle followed the corridor around to the right, where she passed what would have originally been the butler's quarters. Old bells hung silently on the wall nearby, dusty and unused. On her left was a smaller Victorian staircase with an ancient-looking wooden service lift. She remembered that Evelyn had told her that this had been used during the hall's boarding school days, for when trunks and suitcases for the boarders had been stored or brought down at the end of term, when pupils had all dispersed off home for the holidays. It was hard to imagine that hundreds of people had lived and worked here at some time during the hall's history, and now it was only inhabited by 3 people. And 3 very strange people, thought Isabelle. She eventually came into the kitchen, which was a large double-height room that was lit from an enormous skylight in the roof. There were no windows on the walls, although there were a series of doors leading out to the backyard and various corridors. It was the lightest room in the house, which was strange, thought Isabelle, considering it was a windowless room. Stainless steel work surfaces lined the walls, and an industrial-size Aga was squeezed into a recess. It looked as ancient as the house itself. All along the back of the kitchen were tall pine cupboards and drawers, filled with a variety of china ornaments and kitchen utensils. Isabelle assumed that the kitchen hadn't been altered since its time as a school. Certainly there was nothing cosy about it, and Evelyn didn't seem much of a cook. She went over to a large Belfast sink and started to pour herself a glass of water. One of the doors at the back of the kitchen was thrown open, and Robert lurched in, balancing a large box of vegetables, which looked as if they'd been freshly dug up. Clumps of soil crumbled onto the floor as he walked. Isabelle felt a draught of fresh air follow him in. "Hello there," he said cheerfully, pleased to bump into Isabelle again. There wasn't much opportunity for sociability working up at the hall. The Scott Mortons weren't generally the chatting types. Plus, it was highly unusual for visitors to be staying there, especially pretty ones. Isabelle leaned back against the sink and took a sip from the glass. She wasn't sure if she should say anything to Robert, but he seemed friendly and she was desperate to confide in someone. She hesitated, thinking carefully about how much she should reveal. "I've been thinking about what you said." "Oh, yeah?" "I think I might have annoyed Carl." Robert put the box on the table and looked intently at Isabelle. "What happened?" "Well, it's ridiculous, really. I saw something in the house last night. Or at least I think I saw someone. Maybe I dreamt it. Anyway, I mentioned it to Carl and he instantly got annoyed." "Sounds intriguing." "Oh, I don't want to go into details. It's probably better that I don't say any more. You'd probably think me an idiot and I don't want to get you involved. Anyway, I'm going to try something out tonight." "Well, if I can help, let me know." He was curious to know what had happened, but he didn't want to pry too much. He was sure Isabelle would confide in him if she needed to. He was standing with his back to the door, and so he hadn't seen Scarlett enter the kitchen and linger by the entrance, listening. "Still feel bad about leaving you in the pub." "Don't feel bad about what you did, Robert." Scarlett silently moved over to where Isabelle was standing by the sink. She drew up close and gave her an intimate smile. She lifted her hand slowly and sensuously and began to gently stroke Isabelle's blonde hair. Isabelle was too shocked to move or say anything, but merely stood there, letting Scarlett caress her hair. Scarlett then draped her arm across Isabelle's shoulders. She could hear the slow pulse of Scarlett's body and the scent of her perfume, and was both horrified and mesmerized at the same time. Robert watched on in fascination and surprise. Scarlett turned to Isabelle, who was regarding her with a slightly fearful expression, unsure of what she might do next. Memories were flooding back. Suddenly, Scarlett looked up at Robert disdainfully, a change in her mood. "You can get on with your work now," she said, waving him away imperiously. Robert hesitated, not knowing what to say, picking up on Isabelle's unease. He glanced momentarily at the box of vegetables, wondering whether he should say something, but thought better of it. He was, in truth, a little bit intimidated by Scarlett. He looked down at the floor, dug his hands in his pockets and shuffled out into the garden, only glancing back at them briefly before closing the kitchen door. It was past midnight, and inside, the house was still and silent, except for the rain lashing heavily outside. Several miles away, a wild storm had been raging for the last hour, distant lightning occasionally illuminating the blackened and starless sky. Isabelle was fully dressed and had been waiting patiently until the household had gone to sleep. She crept out of her room, checking that no one else was about. The creaking of the door and the floorboards was masked by the sound of the rain. She was carrying a small torch, which illuminated a narrow pathway through the darkness. In her other hand, she was clutching the sheet of music she'd found in Jeremiah Kane's journal. Down the stairs she glided like a shadow, past the mounted animal heads, her torch occasionally catching one of the glassy eyes looking eerily back at her. She reached the bottom of the staircase, and pausing there for a moment she shivered in anticipation, wondering whether she should go through with her plan. The house was icy cold, and Isabelle found that her hands were trembling. Looking around to check that no one was about, she went over to the larger of the two organs that were in the inner library and sat herself down on the stool. She positioned her torch so that she could see the keys and arranged the sheet music in front of her, pressing out the ancient creases with her chilly hands. The tall silvery pipes of the organ reached upwards, towards the heavens, disappearing into the blackening shadows. The last time she played an organ was in church, all those years ago. Her father had been musical, and encouraged her to learn the organ, although she preferred the piano. There was something about this old instrument that brought back vivid memories for Isabelle. All those Sundays in church with her parents, and the familiar sound of the organ playing to majestic hymns, the sacred choreography of so many rituals. Taking a deep breath, she began to play. The tune had an unusual air to it, sounding somewhat creepy and discordant. Isabelle was starting to feel unnerved by the music, but she kept on playing. The eerie timbre began to emanate into the darkest recesses of the house, filling it with the haunting melody. And somewhere in the house, something stirred in the shadows. Isabelle continued to play for what seemed an eternity. After a while, she sensed that she was not alone, and waves of fear began to wash over her. Her fingers played the smooth yellowing keys as Jeremiah's had done all those years ago. She played on, the tune coming surprisingly easy to her nimble fingers. Something stepped out of the darkness and began to slowly descend. She came silently down the stairs, her tangled hair cascading over her shoulders, her dark frozen eyes staring out of her bleached face. Isabelle momentarily stopped, her heart pounding and her nerves electrified. She could feel an icy presence. She was terrified, but took a deep breath and forced herself to continue, her hands visibly shaking. The chill in the air was palpable. She knew that there was something or someone near her, and as she was about to play the final note from the sheet of music, a thin white spectral hand reached out of the shadows and pressed the key. A discordant note emanated throughout the room and pulsated in Isabelle's brain like a clanging bell. She froze, resting her shaking hand on the side of the organ for a moment to steady herself. Grabbing her torch, she swung around to see who was there. She could see no one. The place was empty. She was alone in a room full of shadows. Isabelle was suddenly aware of the rain hammering on the roof. A storm a few miles away was blowing nearer, and she could hear the distant, angry claps of thunder and lightning. Shining her torch into the corners of the library, she began to search for the strange, ghost-like woman. She was afraid, very afraid, but her desperation to solve the mystery of who she was stronger than her fear. Isabelle began her search. She walked from the inner hall towards the back of the house, her path lit by the beam of her torch. She walked slowly and carefully, the passageways and rooms looking unfamiliar and strange in the Stygian gloom. She made her way along a dark corridor and almost jumped out of her skin when her torch lit upon some large indoor potted plants. The shape of the leaves created ugly and grotesque shadows on the wall. Outside, the rain got louder and heavier as the storm grew closer. Isabelle entered a room she hadn't seen before. It was a small laundry. A large Belfast sink sat under a high window, and wooden cupboards surrounded the room. In the centre was an old pine table with a plastic basket, laden high with clothes and a pile of neatly folded-up washing. To her right she noticed a small metal door with an ornate handle that was partly ajar. Putting the torch on the pine table with the direction of the beam pointing at the door, with both hands she turned the handle. It was stiff and heavy, and she had to put some effort into getting it open. The door was incredibly thick and made of metal. It creaked open loudly to reveal a small windowless room. She grabbed the torch off the table and ventured inside. It couldn't have been much bigger than a large cupboard, and on closer inspection, she realised that it was the original walk-in safe for storing the hall's valuables. Scanning her torch around, it became clear that it wasn't being used as a safe by its current owners. It had been converted to a creepy kind of shrine. Strange offerings of teeth and bones hung from the ceiling, and a pentagram was inscribed on the wall. On a makeshift altar in front of it was a necromancer's hand of glory. Isabelle took a sudden step backwards when her torch shone on it. Something unnatural lurked in there, crawling over her senses, making her feel claustrophobic and trapped. Not wanting to spend a moment longer in this horrible place, she beat a hasty retreat from the safe and with a huge effort pushed the heavy door shut. Isabelle couldn't give up now. She had come so far, and although she was afraid, she went back out into the corridor and continued with her search. Isabelle shivered. She pulled her thin blue cardigan tighter around her. In the beam of her torch, she could see her breath white like smoke against the darkness. The walkways had lots of blind corners, and shadows were exacerbated by the moonlight, making Isabelle feel quite vulnerable. She turned a corner by the dining room and began walking towards the kitchen. It was a long corridor that the Scott Mortons had now littered with boxes and odd pieces of spare furniture propped against the walls. Her torch beam glimmered across a glass box hung on the wall. A taxidermy fox posed inside. Isabelle suddenly felt a presence, a coldness that seemed to be radiating from the end of the corridor. She pressed on cautiously, and slowly turning a corner, she thought she could just make out something next to a bookcase in front of her. Isabelle's torch slowly glided up the edge of a doorway. The beam illuminated long tangled hair, and then a half-revealed, deathly pale white face peering around the doorframe. The ghost-like woman made a strange and unearthly hissing noise, and as her eyes bore into Isabelle, her bloodless lips parted, and she snarled, baring her teeth and revealing fangs. Isabelle was too shocked to move, frozen with fear, and for a few seconds couldn't breathe as horror paralysed her body. Then she turned and fled back through the house. In her panic, she managed to drop her torch, which made running along the empty black corridors towards her bedroom all the more terrifying. More than once, she turned back to make sure she wasn't being pursued by the spectral woman. Isabelle threw open the door to her room and rushed in, reaching for the security of the light switch. She grabbed a chair with fumbling hands, and dragging it across the floor, she pushed it against the door, barricading herself in. She stood there, breathless. What the hell had she just seen? What was going on in this house? Isabelle could barely sleep, and when she did, her dreams were bizarre and unsettled, full of terrifying white-faced ghosts swirling around her, hissing in her ears, their long, pale, cadaverous fingers coming towards her throat.